Let's learn how to make a spooky Halloween motion graphic.
Tip Tot.
Hello everybody and welcome back to a spooky Halloween episode of Tip Tot. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday afternoon before Halloween. Today we're going to be taking a look at building this little Halloween animation that you saw in the intro there. It's basically a good way to show you a few cool techniques that I've been looking for in After Effects. Things like particle systems based on images and incorporating 3D image sequences and stuff like that. You can download everything you need to follow along to this tutorial from my website. And without any further ado, we're just going to crack right on with this. Okay, so the first thing you'll need to do is import these animation frames that I've made in Blender into your animation. You'll just notice if you open them up, it is just a pumpkin and he slowly turns around on the scene. So what I'm going to do is select my project window, just hit Control I to import, and that's going to open up the import window. Then you need to navigate to your correct folder. So I've got my Halloween mograph folder here with animation frames. They're all labeled correctly, so that if you hit the first one and choose import as a PNG sequence or import as footage, you can click import and it'll bring that in as a composition inside of which your rotating pumpkin head can be found. If you press space, you'll see it just spins. Lovely. Now I need to make a main composition for this. So I'm going to go to new composition. Going to name this one main. 1080 by 1080 is fine, and 30 frames per second will match that image sequence that we had from Blender. So we're just going to bring that in and we've got our main composition here. I'm going to hit Control Y to add a new solid, which we can call background. And then under my effects and presets panel, I'm just going to add a 4-color gradient. Now I've got a little shortcut which allows me to just press Control space on the layer and type in what I want, which is a 4-color gradient. And we're going to now take the colors that we want from this from our pumpkin layer. So I'm just going to rename this one pumpkin and drag it over there. Now, once that is inside of the composition, you'll notice that we just got a spinning little pumpkin on top of that. And I'm going to choose a frame where it's facing the front, go back to my background layer and the effects controls, and I'm just going to eyedropper a few colors. Not worrying too much here. Just going to try and find some nice dark colors that we can copy. Now, I'm not going to try and replicate like the complete thing here, but you can see I've got yellow and a little bit of purple as well. So let's take our background and we're just going to go down to this bottom left color here, go to purple and just find a nice purple color that we like. And then I'll copy that for this bottom section here. You can then obviously change the position of your points and colors too, if you'd like to. You can just do that by clicking this little dropper option and it will move each one, or you can just obviously click and drag your options off screens to get the colors that you'd like. I think I'd like this one to be just a little bit more bright and this one to be a little bit more saturated. The purple as well, maybe let's make that just a little bit more saturated. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we've got our pumpkin spinning, but it's probably a bit big at the moment. So let's take that scale down until it's in the center. And I'm going to press P Shift S to bring up the position and the scale keyframes. I'm going to go to the end keyframe of it here and also place an additional set of keyframes in. Then I'm going to move this off screen and reduce its scale down to maybe 33. Select all my keyframes and hit F9, which is going to bring up Easy Ease. And then click and drag over this to create a speed graph. Now, if you don't see this speed graph specifically, you probably are looking at the value graph, which looks a little bit different. So you need to make sure that you are on the speed graph to see that. And you'll notice then our pumpkin pops into space and hangs a lot faster and neater. You'll also notice, however, that it does then disappear. So here's a cool trick for you. I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate that layer. And then under my files here, I'm going to go back to my folders inside animation frames, and there's a frame in there just called pumpkin. So I'm just going to bring in that pumpkin. That's going to load into After Effects. And if you select the top pumpkin layer, select the layer in your project, hold Alt, and then drag it over it, it will replace that with all of the scaling and stuff continue to be applied. So I can now just reduce this by cutting it off by clicking and dragging, and now it's going to turn into a static pumpkin once it reaches that point, which is great. Okay, I think it needs a little bit of an overshoot though. So let's go back to say frame 20, and I'm just going to position it up a bit further, and that's going to allow it to go up and then bounce in place. I'm going to select all those keyframes again and start changing the speed. So I'm going to hit F9 to bring them back to normal easy ease. Now we want this to launch in slowly, launch in fast and go slow. So we'll just do that normal one. Then we want it to go from fast to slow after it bounces back down. So it kind of hovers in the air and then settles. Much better. Bam, bam. That looks pretty good. Okay. Then I think we're going to want it to like drift up and down a bit. So I'm going to go to exactly 4 seconds with my first frame here. Sorry, exactly 1 second. Go to maybe 3 seconds. And I'm just going to shift the pumpkin down a little bit. I'll go to 5 seconds and I'll shift the pumpkin up a little bit. And I'll go to 7 seconds and I will copy the position keyframe from the beginning to completely loop that. And then we've got it coming up, landing, and then slowly drifting, okay? Well, that looks a little bit weird though. So we'll take this and we'll just control click that first keyframe, turn it back to linear. And that's gonna make it snap into that position a bit better. Boom, so it doesn't lose that emphasis, okay? So if we looked at the speed of these, you'll notice it goes fast to slow, and you can even really emphasize that. Oh, excuse me. If you just select the one frame, you can really emphasize that. There you go, that looks much nicer. And then it's going to start easing back in, and you can, excuse me, you could make it just a little bit easy if you did that. Yeah, that looks much nicer. Okay, so really slow bobbing section at the end there. Great. We've got our pumpkin scaling in and splooshing down. Let's take a look at what the next steps were. So we can see here at the moment, our pumpkin kind of zooms in like so, and then some bats come out of it. So let's do that spotlight in the background first. We're going to hit Control Y to create a new solid, and we'll just call this light. That's going to create a new white solid on top of everything. Then I'm going to apply an effect called Radial Wipe, which you'll notice if I choose Transition Completion, you can make sort of like a radial wipe. Let's set this to about 80%, and I'll just tweak the start angle until I get something I'm happy with, maybe 35. In fact, if we set this to 90% and we set it to half of 36, which is 10% of 360, it should then go bang in the middle, which is great for us. I'm just going to take the Y position starting of this wipe center and just bring it all the way down until it roughly hits the top corners there. Lovely. Let's turn the feather up a bit. And let's change the blending mode to something like soft light. Cool, that looks pretty good. I'm going to position this below everything, Control open square bracket. And I'm going to open up the opacity keyframes with T. And I think we'll just keyframe from 0 to 100 when the light turns on. And then we're going to do some toggle keyframes for it to flash on and off. So it's going to come in, and then we want it to flash from 100 to a 0. So we'll put 100 there, maybe 0 next to it here, move over just a little bit more, go back up to 100. Maybe a quicker turn to 0 and back to 100 again. I'm just kind of randomly doing these. Let's set it to 0 there, 100 here. Then let's have it go back to 0, but this time we won't put a whole keyframe on this one, and we'll have it go slowly back up to 100. So if you look at this at the moment, it's going to just start sort of winking in and out, which, you know, might look okay. Alternatively, you could select all the keyframes, right click and choose toggle hold keyframe, which will just stop it from changing in between until it hits. You'll notice it stays at 100 and goes to 0 there. So it'll fade in and then it'll flash on and off a bit more before blinking back finally into life. Okay, that looks pretty good. So how do we do this particle system where the bats erupt out of this pumpkin's mouth? Well, it's quite simple actually. I'm going to find a point where the pumpkin is settled, maybe say here, and I'm going to create a new solid, and I'm going to call this one particles. And we're going to add onto that CC particle world. Now, don't be alarmed by this little pop-up box that I get. That is literally the same as me just clicking the effects and presets panel. It's just a shortcut, okay? So we've got our particles. I'm just going to, for the sake of neatness, position them just above my pumpkin. Although we'll be turning it into a 3D layer later on, so it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to go to my project window, and I'm going to import bat.fla, which when you do, you'll realize it's a little animated bat I've made in Adobe Animate. And it's then going to sort of flap in place, and we're going to use this object as our particle. Okay, so once it's imported, it's going to say save imported files too, because you have to save it. It will automatically choose the correct folder, and it'll create a composition for you with a little flapping bat. Now, don't worry about the white background. That's not there. It's actually transparent. So inside our main window here, we're just going to drag that bat composition down to below the particles composition. And you can see we've got our flapping bat here. Now I'm going to go inside this composition, and I'm going to change its composition settings to be the full 9-second duration that we've got for our composition here. And then I'm just going to duplicate this a whole bunch of times. And we're going to sequence these layers. So select all of them from the bottom to the top, right click. Where am I looking for? Keyframe assistant, sequence layers, no overlap. That's fine. We'll need a few more. And I'm just doing this rather than looping it to get over that quick flashing frame error that you sometimes get. And for these ones, we'll just position them manually like so. So now we've got full 9 seconds of our looping bat, which is going to be helpful for us because we're going to use this bat as a frame of reference for our particle system. So navigate to a point where you can see loads of the particles, and we're going to start messing with the particle world settings. Okay, so first of all, how long would you like these things to last for? Well, let's take a look at the settings I did last time to show you how much they've changed. Okay, so you can see that the bats got burst out and then start flying up, and they scale up in position 2. So let's find our particle, and you can see that I've changed quite a few of the settings here. Birth rate and stuff has stayed the same, but it does animate over time. So if I collapse all this down, you can see there's a few keyframes. But the main thing is we've changed the physics and we've changed the particles of this system, okay? So we're just going to use this as a reference as we go to our other one here. So birth rate, that's fine. Producer though, we want to spread the producer out and position it so that it fits over our pumpkin's mouth. So whilst the pumpkin is in a settled position, i.e. over a direct keyframe, you can pick whip your particle system to your pumpkin so that your particles will move when your pumpkin moves, okay? Or at least the solid layer will move, which will become important later on. The particle system here, if we just drag it above our pumpkin, actually, we'll be able to see. I'm going to position this so that it's in the center of the pumpkin's mouth, and so that the radius of it kind of fits the rough shape of the pumpkin mouth too, okay? Down under physics, we're going to change it from explosive to jet sideways. And we're going to start messing around with the velocity of it. The gravity I'm going to change to 0, which means they're going to come out in a straight line first. Then we're going to animate it so they start flying upwards after that. Okay. And we'll start messing around with this a bit later. The floor position, I'm going to drop it off because we're going to use this to cut the bats off later on. And we're just going to say floor animation will be normal and floor action normal, none as well. Particle visibility, though, importantly, is going to be above floor, which means when we bring this floor up later, they're going to remove the bats. Let's scroll down our particle layer here and choose particle type textured square. All our particles are going to disappear. Do not panic. What we're going to do instead is take the texture of that particle layer and choose our bat layer. And as you can see, our bats start to come in. But they're all sort of flying in sync at the moment, which doesn't look great. So we're going to take our texture time and just go to birth. And that's going to change it to be, they will start from the start of that layer when that particle is born. And that's going to mean that all of the bats are going to act a bit more individually. Okay. So how do we, and you'll notice now that the bats are attached to the pumpkin too. Let's turn off our actual bat layer because we don't want that big flapping one. We just want these bats here. And we'll just move the particle layer to start just shortly after the pumpkin lands. So we've got the pumpkin coming up, and then it's going to start to emerge from the bats. Cool. So this is where we're going to start editing some of the keyframes. I would like the resistance of these bats. The resistance is going to kind of clump them together if you turn that on. So we can turn that up for the beginning so that they're roughly following the bat's shape. And then we're going to keyframe that resistance at the start of our layer. We're then going to go over, say, maybe a second, and we're going to just turn that resistance down to 0. Then let's press U to bring up our keyframes, and then you'll see the bats begin to emerge and then spread out. So we want that to happen a lot more quickly. So maybe we'll position that keyframe just a few frames after the start. They'll merge and clump before spreading. Perfect. A few more things. Let's keyframe the velocity. What happens if we crank up the velocity? Let's have a look. They start to spread out loads, and it's the speed at which they come out. So let's change that velocity to maybe 3 at the beginning here, and then move over some and keyframe it back down to say 1. There. Press U to bring up our new keyframes. Okay, that looks pretty okay. Let's maybe drag that back just a little bit. The most important one here is going to be gravity. So let's keyframe the gravity at 0, and then it's going to crank down later on so the bats start flying up. Okay. Look at that. Press U to bring up the keyframes. They emerge and then start floating up. Okay. So you'll notice if we actually crank up the depth size to be just 1, which is going to be the original size, or even more than that, you'll notice that the bats have some weird coloring to them. That's because of their birth to death. If you just change both of these to white, it'll go back to the original colors of our animation, which is good there. Max opacity, we want to be 100, so they look a little bit more solid. Let's see how that works. There we go. And you'll notice that our resistance here needs adjusting now that the scale of the bats has changed. Let's take a look at that. Looks okay. Let's see what we did in our previous one here. They kind of go further down more. So we can see what birth rate 2, and then they obviously go down to 0 because we wanted to stop them birthing. The gravity goes from 0.85 to negative something. And what it's doing at the moment is just at 0, which means they're all coming out flat. So we want there to be some gravity. So let's put the same gravity on. Okay. And then you want that gravity to just really go. So they burst forth. Pretty good. Let's take that birth rate, keyframe that from 2 down to 0. Looks pretty good. I don't like that initial burst though, like the bats are kind of hanging there. So I'm just going to change the extra, which is just going to reposition them just a little bit. That's quite nice. And I think we'll turn the resistance down as well. There we go. They burst forward and then they start rising up again. Let's move that gravity so it works a bit quicker. So they start rising away a bit nicer. That's good. And the velocity, let's put that down to 2. Yeah, nice. But let's also crank up my radius X a little bit as well. But let's animate that. So radius X, we're going to keyframe, bring it further out like this. And let's change that extra until we get something a bit more that we're happy with. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Last step is to take the floor of this animation. So we can find that under particle and then floor, or it'll be here somewhere. Floor, here we go. So floor position. And then let's just animate that going up, which will stop these guys clumping at the bottom. So we take our floor position and you notice we change these up, it will stop them appearing so often. And I think because we set the extra to be pretty high, if we turn that extra down, Yeah, you'll see it and you'll notice it's changed that. Particle visibility needs to be only visible above the floor. So you'll notice that that will change. So let's take the floor here and let's shift that animation over a little bit. So we've got our floor animation here. Let's make it a bit later and then they'll start to disappear like so. They're still a little bit clumped together though. So let's increase our radius Y just a touch. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's compare it to the original. Now the original, they all burst out, get a bit closer to the camera and rise up more, but you can see that as you play with your settings, they'll kind of react to those so you can get something that you're happy with. I think I'm going to keyframe the extra. So they start off here, then as they rise, the extra is going to go and spread out a bit. Yeah, that looks much nicer. All the bats fly away. Wicked. Okay. So there are our bat layers. Nice. And we've got our floating pumpkin and we've got our animated spotlight layer as well. So the next step is to bring in our Happy Halloween layers. So I'm just going to go to my first keyframe of the pumpkin here, go back to my project window, and we're going to drag in happyhalloween.psd. And this is just a text layer that I've made in Photoshop with a few stroke layers and things on it like that. And once that imports, we're going to import it as a composition, of course, and drag that composition down here. Okay. Now, before we go much further, it's probably best to start thinking about the 3D aspect of these layers. So I'm going to collapse all of my layers down and everything but the background, I'm going to turn into a 3D layer. Just click OK on that. And then we're going to add in a new camera. So layer, new camera. 50mm is fine, doesn't really matter too much for this project. We're going to bring up the camera control with position and A, so P-Shift-A for position and point of interest. And we'll keyframe both of those. And then say go to 2 seconds in and keyframe them again. Then for the last section here, we're just going to press C until we can bring up our zoom tool. And we're going to zoom all the way in until our pumpkin kind of fills the screen. Then pressing C again, we're going to go to our pan options and we're just going to pan down just a little bit. Then our pumpkin's going to come out like so, like this, okay? Now, point of interest has changed a little bit, so we're going to have to just tweak that back until our layer suits. But not to worry, because we're going to be positioning these to fix this. So at the moment, if we bring up the position keyframe of all of these elements, all of our elements are on a single flat layer, okay? We want to be able to push those back and forth in Z space to fix some of these issues that we're seeing. For example, here, I am going to just quickly position my spotlight and just bring it so that the red line is below the frame. Then that's going to fix it for this last scene here. But I'm also going to crank the Z space so that it's in front of our pumpkin, so that it feels like it's lighting the pumpkin a little bit. The bats, I'm only going to put like very slightly in front of the pumpkin. So we'll maybe put those at like 30 or something, negative 30 to put them slightly in front of the pumpkin. And the Happy Halloween, I'm going to put at maybe 100, which will push them behind the pumpkin, which you'll notice if we move it around like this, okay? So that will fix all of the elements here, and you'll notice our pumpkin now flies in and then moves into position. We can fix some of the camera speed movement with a bit of quick F9 and adjusting. Take a look. Ooh. Looks pretty good. Apart from I don't really like this, I'm just going to move the pumpkin down so that when it launches into frame, it doesn't go out of frame so much. So we can just fix that. Boom, boom. It looks much nicer. So you can see that our pumpkin doesn't go out of frame now when it flies in. Happy Halloween. Okay, spooky. Last step then is to add the animation to the Happy Halloween stuff. So we'll go to the frame where we want that animation to start, and we'll just start our layer there with open square bracket. I'm going to drag a mask over Happy. I'm going to duplicate Halloween. I'm going to press Control D. I'm going to twirl down my mask and change it to subtract, and that's going to give us Halloween down on the bottom there. And then I'm just going to bring up position, shift, opacity for both of these layers, keyframe them, move over, say 2 full seconds, and keyframe them all again. Let's go back to our first layer here, and we'll just rename these for clarity. We'll rename it Happy, and we'll rename this one Halloween. And I'm just going to scale down, move down, and change the opacity of the Happy layer. And the Halloween layer will move up and change down the opacity of. We may need to come back and add scale to these later, but we'll see. And we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I'm just going to tweak the final positions until I'm happy with them, just by shifting some of these down. Okay, great. They look pretty good, but let's add some easing to that with F9. And just a little bit of influence, not all the way like usual. Right, let's take our Happy layer, and I'm going to add a Turbulent Displace to get that rippling effect that we had. And if I go forward in the animation, you'll notice that it's all squiffy now. So I'm just going to go to the last keyframe here, and I'm going to keyframe amount and size. Okay, I'm going to go back to the first keyframe here, and we'll then add a keyframe for amount and size. And we'll reduce both these to 0. It'll only go down to 2, so it will remain a little bit wobbly, but nothing you'll notice. And then on the first one here, we're just going to crank the size and the amount up so that as it moves along, it's going to go from really twisted and warped and move back to its normal shape. We will just F9 those. Now I've got really twisted and warped there. And we'll do the same thing for Halloween. We can add a Turbulent Displace. You might be wondering why I didn't do this before I duplicated the layer. And that's because you're not going to need the same settings. So it doesn't take too long to just do it after you've duplicated it, because the amount and the size that you'll need to make it look good are going to be different because the length of the word is different. For example, you might want to crank the size of the Halloween one down so it's way more warped, and the amount up so that it's a bit more creepy. Oh, look at that E shifting. Yeah, that looks really good. So I'm going to position those in the right place, and we're going to hit F9. And then we've got Happy Halloween. So we're definitely going to need to scale these as well. So Shift S on both those layers will change the scale. Let's add a couple of keyframes in. And let's go down to maybe 50% for both of those. And that will just mean that they look a bit more like they're growing out of the pumpkin. Like so. Let's briefly ease those things off. And let's compare it against our original. So our original comes busting in, zooming out, and bursting open like so. It does rotate a couple of times again. The other thing is we need to pin these layers to the pumpkin. So I'm going to go to the bit where I lined them up, grab both Happy and Halloween. I'm going to pin that to the pumpkin layer so that they will like bounce up and down with the pumpkin. And then I'm going to go, say maybe 5 seconds, grab my pumpkin layer. I'm going to duplicate it again, but I'm going to go up to my project window, go back to my pumpkin composition, alt click it to replace it. Oops, reposition it correctly. And there we'll get that spin in as well. Okay. So we'll go to the section where it's the right size. So it's the right scale. We just need to tweak the position for it. Pretty good. We'll take this and we'll pin it to the original pumpkin layer. And then we can split the pumpkin layer like so and remove it. And our pumpkin will spin once again. So we've got, oh, Happy Halloween. And you'll notice that the shapes still follow the pumpkin because the layer is still there. We've just swapped it out once more for the spin. I think I added a little bit of a glow to the pumpkin as it spun in. So let's do that. I've got the original pumpkin layer here. Now I've got something called Deep Glow, which is a plugin, and it makes it just glow really nicely. But you could do the exact same thing with just the glow plugin and a bit more of playing with the threshold and things like that. So you could get the threshold out, increase the radius a little bit, turn down the intensity, that sort of thing. I just find deep glow for me is way easier. I can just go boop, and there you go, it's done. And I think I did a radius of 300 and it just looks a bit nicer. Keyframe the radius and the exposure down to 0. And you get that nice glowing pumpkin and bats that burst out of its mouth with a happy Halloween. Okay, so the last and final step then, I'm just going to collapse all of these things down. I'm going to press Control-Alt-Y to add an adjustment layer on top. I'm going to give that adjustment layer a bit of noise, maybe 5%. We don't want to use color noise. That just adds a nice little bit of layering to the gradient there. And another thing that I sometimes like to do is add, a turbulent displace to this layer with a size that is as small as possible. And you'll notice all this like roughness to the edges. You start playing with the amount, maybe bringing it down to like 3 or maybe 10. You'll start to notice a little bit of bumpiness. Just bring it into the edges, bring up the complexity of that bumpiness. You get something really crispy and nice. And you get that really kind of crunchy edge to your animations, which I really like. And that is it. This will add quite a bit of a render time, that last step, the noise and the crunchiness of the turbulent displace. So be aware of that. I'm just going to turn it off now so that we can take a look at the animation. And there we have it. Finished, looking pretty good. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, everyone. If you did, make sure you consider subscribing, liking, commenting, all that sort of thing. And let me know if you want more tutorials like this in this kind of freeform style. I just did this little extra one for Halloween. So thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you next time for a less spooky episode of Tip Top. I'd like to say a massive thank you to my level 2 and above members: Unknown Ghosts, WN62, Anonymous, Brood Draws, Mel M. Hoover, Maybe Sharma, Ralika M, Mun336, and Ian Costello. You guys are lovely. If you'd like to get exclusive membership to a Discord, shoutouts, and personal design feedback, check out the membership to Tip Tot Zone by clicking the join button below.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.